My name is Grant Ellison, and for 6 years I believed Isla and I had forged a partnership built on unwavering trust and mutual respect, a balance as delicate and effortless as two dancers moving in sync. We prided ourselves on giving each other room to breathe, to maintain friendships outside our marriage without the weight of suspicion or jealousy. Her evenings spent laughing with her closest girlfriends at chic rooftop bars, and my card nights with the guys over beers and poker chips felt like small celebrations of our individuality. I reveled in the way we uplifted and encouraged one another, confident that our connection was sturdy enough to withstand time and distance. On that particular Friday night, she kissed me goodbye in her familiar, breezy way. Soft lips against mine, a playful tug at my collar, and that half-smile that always made me feel cherished. "Have fun," I told her, watching as she slipped into her sleek leather jacket and slid behind the wheel of her car. She wound down the window to blow me a kiss, and I watched her headlights vanish around the corner. I turned back into the warm glow of our living room and reached for my phone when it rang. It was Tarek, my oldest friend. His voice, deep and serious, carried a tension I'd never heard before. He said he needed to talk, something between us, man to man. I grabbed my keys and jacket without hesitation, murmuring my goodbyes to the empty room, confident that Isla was off to the birthday celebration she'd mentioned. The drive to Tarek's apartment was crisp and quiet, the night air carrying the distant hum of the city mingled with the faint promise of rain. My mind flickered between anticipation of whatever urgent matter Tarek had and the comfortable certainty that Isla was someplace safe, someplace she belonged. I turned onto Lincoln Avenue, the street lamp halos dancing on wet pavement, when a familiar dark shape hit me like a punch to the chest. There, parked curbside, was Isla's car. My breath caught as I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding so loudly I thought the engine might stall. I sat for a moment, engine idling, as the adrenaline clamored through my veins. My rational mind raced. Maybe she'd stopped for a drink before heading to the party. Maybe her friend's birthday was at that romantic little bistro I'd heard about. I forced my grip on the steering wheel to loosen, took a slow breath, and glanced inside the restaurant through the rain-speckled window. What I saw shattered every ounce of composure I possessed. Isla wasn't perched at a high-top stool with a cocktail in hand, off to honor a friend's milestone. She was seated at a candlelit table, her hair cascading over one shoulder as she leaned in, radiant and unguarded, toward a man whose features I didn't recognize. He wore a tailored blazer and had an easy confidence, his hand resting atop hers as if he owned the space between them. Her eyes sparkled in the soft glow of the candlelight, her smile warm and flirtatious, entirely unlike the polite, distant smirk one reserves for acquaintances. She was vulnerable, open, and tethered to someone whose presence had no place in our story. The scene froze me in place, my pulse thundering so hard it felt like someone had placed their fist against my sternum. Instinct warred with disbelief. I wanted to ignore it, to chalk it up to some strange misunderstanding. That maybe the guy was a friend from work she hadn't mentioned. But the tenderness in his touch, the way she leaned into him, the laughter that danced between them, it spoke a language I knew all too well: intimacy. I forced myself to release the clutch, pull forward, and park directly across the street. I stayed in the car for several long seconds, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel, mind spinning with questions I wasn't ready to ask. It would have been easier to drive away, to wait until morning when the light might lend clarity or comfort. But something twisted inside me and snapped, a realization that I was no longer a man secure in his marriage. I was a husband standing on the precipice of a life-shattering truth. I climbed out of the car, each step toward the restaurant a drumbeat of dread in my ears. The world narrowed until the only thing I saw was her and the man whose warmth had displaced me. I rehearsed what I might say, what excuse she might conjure, but my legs carried me forward before my mind could halt them. The restaurant door swung open under the glow of a brass lantern, and I stepped inside, instantly surrounded by the soft murmur of other patrons and the gentle clink of silverware. The familiar scent of wine and grilled sea bass hung in the air, but it made my stomach churn. Then I saw her. Isla's laughter died in her throat when she caught sight of me framed in the doorway. Her companion's expression shifted from amusement to confusion as I made my way toward them. I approached their table with deliberate calm, slid into the empty chair beside her without a word, and placed both hands on the polished wood. She swallowed, her eyes wide and glossy, as I offered her a slow, quiet smile and said in a level voice, I was just passing by. Silence stretched taut between us, louder than any accusation. I folded my arms on the table and waited for an explanation that would unravel this image of betrayal. But in that moment, I understood something essential. This night, this moment, marked the end of the trust one had worn like armor and the beginning of a journey toward reclaiming my own worth. At first, I wanted to believe the best. I really did. Maybe Isla had stopped in to meet a friend for a pre-party drink. Maybe the guy was someone from work, or a friend of her brother's, or someone she'd bumped into unexpectedly. I clung to those thoughts like driftwood in a rising tide. My hands were still on the steering wheel, parked directly across from the restaurant, the glow from the windows casting warm amber light across the sidewalk. The scene through the glass didn't look suspicious in the obvious ways. No frantic touches. No hurried kisses. It was subtle, comfortable. That was what undid me. She wasn't sitting across from him like two people who had just run into each other. They weren't catching up awkwardly or politely sipping drinks with too much space between their elbows. They were side by side, his arms stretched behind her on the back of the booth, his body turned inward toward her like they'd done this before, like this wasn't new. Her body language was soft, leaning in. She laughed and touched his wrist at one point, her head tilting in that playful way I used to see when we were still dating, when everything was fresh and uncertain. His hand was on hers, not resting by accident, not in a fleeting, casual way. It was deliberate, gentle, possessive. I blinked, hoping maybe I was projecting, hoping the wine, the lighting, the angle from which I sat was somehow warping reality into something sinister it wasn't. But no amount of blinking could change the image before me. I knew Isla. I knew her better than anyone else in the world, or so I thought. I knew the way she looked when she was relaxed. I knew the way she smiled when she was hiding something. I'd seen both expressions tonight, and I knew with cold, settling certainty that I was not mistaken. Still, I didn't feel anger. Not yet. It was too early for that. I was still trying to breathe. I reached for my phone, thought about calling her, about asking a simple, calm question, "Hey, are you still heading to that party?" To see if she'd lie outright. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Part of me didn't want to hear her voice. Part of me didn't want to catch her mid-lie. There was something sacred about silence in that moment, about the raw, unfiltered truth playing out before me with no words to dull the edge. I watched her laugh again, watched him lean in and say something that made her lips part in that soft, familiar grin, the one I used to see from across our kitchen table on Sunday mornings, coffee in hand, sunlight on her face. My stomach twisted. I sat back in my seat, letting the full weight of it settle on me like a blanket I hadn't realized I'd been wearing backwards for years. All the little things I had brushed off, the just friends she didn't introduce me to, the text she never let me see, the night she came home late with vague stories about impromptu plans. I hadn't been suspicious because I didn't want to live like that. I'd told myself love without trust was already dead, so I chose to trust. I gave her that gift freely, and I never thought I'd pay for it like this. Even now, as I sat in my car staring at the undeniable truth of her betrayal, I still didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to storm in, yell, demand answers, or disrupt the evening like some character in a bad movie. No, that wasn't me. That had never been me. I wanted understanding more than vengeance. I wanted to know why. When did this start? Was it serious? Did she love him? Was she planning to tell me? Had she felt guilt? Regret? Or had I just become invisible to her? The thought stung deeper than I expected, because that was what this looked like. Not some heated, impulsive affair. It looked rehearsed. It looked like routine. This wasn't a first date. It was an established rhythm. She knew his face, his voice, the way he held her hand. She'd memorized this. They had a rhythm, and it was different from ours. That's what made the breath leave my chest. I remembered the kiss she gave me just an hour earlier. How easy it had been for her to lean in, touch my face, and lie straight through her smile. I remembered the sound of her heels clicking down our porch steps, the way she waved, how she turned the music up in her car like it was just another night. It wasn't. Not for me. A car behind me honked, snapping me out of my haze. I realized I had been sitting there for at least 15 minutes. My eyes stung, but I hadn't cried. There was nothing dramatic about it. Just a slow, cold unraveling of something I had believed in. I checked my rearview mirror, adjusted the mirror to look at myself. The man staring back was pale, tight-jawed, quiet. I looked older than I had this morning. I looked like someone who had just lost something he didn't even know he was fighting to keep. I turned the car off and sat in the silence. I needed to decide something. Do I stay here and keep watching until they leave? Do I wait for her to catch me watching and panic? Do I pretend I never saw it and let it rot me from the inside? No, I couldn't unknow what I now knew. That version of our marriage, our life, had been pierced. Even if I looked away, it would still be there. This was the moment the crack stopped being invisible. The first tear didn't fall until I lowered my head into my hands. And even then, it wasn't grief that made me cry, it was clarity. The knowledge that whatever came next would be different. That I was no longer a man safe inside his marriage. I was standing at the edge of a truth I hadn't asked for, hadn't prepared for, but one I could no longer ignore. And that truth was staring back at me through the restaurant window, with my wife's smile on its face and another man's hand on hers. I pulled into the spot directly across the street from the restaurant and sat for a moment, rigid in the driver's seat, as the reality of what I'd just seen burned into my mind. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, but every other sound, the distant rumble of traffic, the jitter of a passing motorcycle, the muffled laughter leaking through the restaurant windows, felt amplified, like some cruel spotlight turned up to full wattage. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't consider picking up my phone at all. My senses were tied to the glass before me, the warm glow behind it, and the soft shape of her silhouette perched beside that man I didn't know. It felt absurd, almost cinematic, as though life had paused to let me stare at an image that should not exist. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched. A smarter man would have driven away, waited until morning, and confronted her with the subdued calm that nighttime distance often grants. But I wasn't that man, or at least I didn't feel like him right then. I was a husband standing outside the lie he'd been living in. I wasn't angry yet. Anger demands context, requires fuel, but this was still the haze of disbelief, the slow slide into heartbreak. I felt hollow and heavy all at once, like I'd swallowed a stone that refused to settle. I checked the mirror. My reflection looked strange, ghostly even, dark circles beneath my eyes, jaw clenched so tight I could feel the tension knotting my neck. Exhaling, I released the parking brake, cutting the engine's monotone hum. The abrupt silence pressed against me, and for a fleeting moment I hesitated. The rational voice in my head scolded me, reminding me of the risks. What if she saw you? What if you caused a scene? What if this destroys everything? My heart thundered a punishing rhythm, but my feet were already moving. I opened the door and stepped onto the curb, the cool night air rushing in to fill the void left by the engine. My breath came in measured puffs, each one creating a small cloud in the streetlight haze, as if my disappointment and dread were visible. Each step toward the entrance sucked the warmth from the world around me. The closer I got, the more I noticed details I'd overlooked before, the way the waiter paused mid-step, eyes flicking up at me with something like recognition before shifting away, the soft jangle of the bell above the door as I entered. The hushed murmur of other diners, heads turning in mild curiosity, the faint scent of garlic and basil wafting from the kitchen beside the richer perfume of her perfume. My pulse raced, mind replaying every second of her earlier kiss goodbye, that breezy, "I love you," she tossed over her shoulder as she walked to the car. It felt like part of me had been left behind in our living room when I'd walked out. Through the glass partition, I saw them again. Her, leaning into him, hair brushing bare skin at the nape of her neck. Him, tilting his head as he spoke something that made her laugh, the sound so familiar it pounded at my chest. I noticed how she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear the way she used to do when she was nervous around me, and how he pressed his thumb to the back of her hand, lingering as if the contact tethered him to something he feared losing. The sight of their comfort, the way he gazed at her as though she were the only thing in the world that mattered, shattered something essential inside me. Trust, like glass, can cut you sharply when it breaks. I pushed through the door and stood for a heartbeat in the threshold, the soft chord of a piano drifting through the foyer from somewhere beyond the host's podium. My eyes locked onto her figure, Isla's back straight, shoulders relaxed, every inch the confident woman I knew. And yet someone wholly foreign. She turned as I stepped forward, and time dilated. I watched recognition flicker in her eyes, followed instantly by shock, regret, panic. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The stranger beside her, tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, shifted in his seat, confusion creasing his brow. Without a word, I approached their table with deliberate calm, each footstep a protest against the tempest roiling inside me. I reached the chair beside them and pulled it out silently, sliding into it with the ease of a man who owns every inch of the room. Other diners glanced my way, some with polite curiosity, most returning to their conversations with only a flick of an eyebrow. I folded my hands on the table, heart drumming behind my ribs like a primal drumbeat. Isla's eyes flicked between my face and the man across from her. He stammered something. I didn't realize you two knew each other. But she shook her head, biting her lip. The waiter hovered, confused, waiting for a cue. I looked toward him and said evenly, "A glass of your house red, please. Dry." The waiter's eyes darted between us, then he nodded cautiously and scurried away. The soft scratch of his notepad seemed to echo across the table like a verdict. Isla cleared her throat, voice small, "Grant, I can explain." I held up a finger, silencing her with small kindness I didn't feel. Kindness, I realized, was a luxury I could no longer afford. I let my eyes slide over to the man beside her. Damien, she would call him later, reading his worry, his disbelief. I exhaled slowly, the single breath loosening some of the tension in my shoulders. "You're right," I said quietly to her. "You can." The words hovered, taut as a drawn bowstring. Her shoulders slumped, the confident facade dissolving as guilt seeped through her features. I took a moment to study her upturned face. The way her lips trembled, the gloss of unshed tears in her gaze, the way she wrapped her hands around each other as if trying to hold herself together. It was a heartbreaking tableau. But I wasn't there for heartbreak. I was there for truth. I needed this moment to exist in full clarity, to feel every ache, every betrayal, without the distractions of excuses or denials. I needed to see her own sense of guilt reflected in her eyes, to know that the trust I'd given her was finally broken and that there was no going back. As the waiter returned with my drink, I lifted the glass and let the deep crimson liquid swirl beneath the candlelight. I looked directly into her eyes and said, "To clarity." Then I set the glass back down, hands slick with condensation, and waited for the reckoning to begin. The quiet rage had carried me across the street. Now, in the hushed, candlelit glow of that restaurant, I was ready to face what came next. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the restaurant, the soft chime of the bell above announcing my arrival like a tolling of fate. Inside, lanterns glowed over each table, casting a golden haze over white linen and polished glass. Low jazz music drifted through the air, mingling with the faint murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware. The scent of garlic, balsamic reduction, and sea breeze transported me elsewhere, yet the moment I saw Isla seated at the corner table, every other detail fell away. I recognized the curve of her neck where her hair fell in waves, the high cheekbones that caught the light, even the way she tucked her fingers around a wine glass. Beside her sat the man whose presence had upended my world, tall, dark, confident, with a neatly trimmed beard and a tailored blazer that spoke of money and ease. Their table was set for two, yet when I arrived, it looked like it might have been intended for three, an empty chair at the head, its cushions slightly indented as though awaiting my arrival. I stalked past a hostess arranging flowers in a vase and moved directly to that chair, pulling it out with deliberate calm. Isla's laughter died on her lips. The stranger froze, confusion etched across his brow. I slid into the seat without a word, folding my hands on the table as though I belonged there just as much as they did. My sudden presence turned heads. Some diners paused mid-bite, eyebrows knitting. Others exchanged whispered glances before returning to their meals. I felt their eyes burn into my back. I felt the electricity in the room grow taut as a wire, but I paid them no mind. All that mattered was the woman in front of me and the man beside her. Isla stared first at the chair, then at my face. Her eyes flickered with disbelief, confusion, and fear in quick succession. The stranger, Damien, cleared his throat, his forced smile more like a grimace. He raised one hand in a polite gesture, as though to introduce himself to me properly, a courtesy that now felt laden with insult. "Grant," he said, voice steady but hollow. "I didn't." Isla placed a finger on his wrist, silencing him, and opened her mouth to speak. I raised a hand, stopping her before the first syllable could escape. "No need," I said, voice low but carrying through the hush. "I was just passing by." My words hung in the air, small and precise. The waiter hovered uncertainly at our table's edge, napkin draped over his arm, eyes darting between the three of us. I glanced at him and added, "We'll take 3 glasses of red. Dry." The waiter blinked and bowed once, hurried off into the dimly lit corridor leading to the bar. Silence stretched taut. Isla's soft pink lips parted, but no words came. Damien shifted in his seat, the leather of the booth creaking beneath him. I leaned back slightly, the chair's cushioned back supporting me as though beneath me lay a bed of coals, ready to ignite. Across the table, Isla's hands trembled as she reached for the wine list, flicking through pages like someone afraid of what she might find. I studied her pressed blouse, the soft curve of her collarbone, the glittering gold pendant she always wore that read forever. Forever, I thought, as though the irony of its name twisted like a knife in my chest. When the waiter returned, he placed 3 glasses before us. I settled the crystal stem of mine between my fingers and let the deep burgundy liquid swirl gently, observing how the light caught its depths. Isla's gaze remained fixed on mine, as though searching for a flicker of the man she knew. Damien looked from me to Isla, lips pursed, uncertainty heavy in his eyes. I raised my glass in a quiet salute, the soft clink of crystal punctuating the moment. "To unexpected reunions," I said, curling my fingers around the stem. My tone was calm, too calm, and it sent a ripple of unease across the table. Silence again. Then Isla whispered, voice trembling, "Grant." Her words collided with the tension in the air and fractured. I set my drink down gently, the sound louder than my voice. "Isla," I said softly, leaning forward so that no one else could hear, "you told me you were heading to a birthday party." I paused, letting the truth of my words settle on her like dust. "This looks nothing like that." She pressed her lips together, blinked rapidly, and glanced at Damien, whose throat worked as though he might speak. But she placed her hand over his, squeezed gently, and turned back to me. "Grant, it isn't what, exactly?" I asked, tone neutral. "Is it a party? Is this a friend's celebration?" "Because I don't see the balloons, the cupcakes, or the music loud enough to mask your confession." My gaze flicked to Damien. "Is this a surprise party for me?" I offered the faintest hint of a sardonic smile. He swallowed, shook his head, and dropped his gaze to the table. The waiter reappeared to refill my glass, hands steady despite the tension. I watched him leave, then turned back to Isla, as though I expected her to conjure some miracle explanation. But her eyes brimmed with tears, and she glanced away, unable to meet mine. At that moment, I realized she wasn't preparing to spin a story. She was preparing to dismantle the one we built together. A hollow ache spread across my chest. I didn't leap to my feet. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached for my ring finger, felt the cool metal of the wedding band that had bound us together for so many years, and slipped it off. I held it out on my palm, weighing it in the soft glow of the candlelight, then placed it on the table between her and Damien. The ring shimmered against the white linen, a cruel reminder of permanence made fragile by deceit. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would burst through my chest, but I kept my face composed. I stood, smoothing my jacket, voice quiet as I said, "I think you two should finish your date." The words drifted through the sudden hush and wrapped around us like a final curtain. Isla's hand flew to her mouth. Tears slid down her cheeks. Damien looked mortified. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of every gaze on me, and without another word, I turned and strode toward the exit. The door closed softly behind me, and the world exhaled. Outside, the night air tasted of rain and liberation. I paused on the sidewalk, took a steadying breath, and let the buzz of neon signs and distant car horns wash over me. The restaurant door glowed behind me, a beacon of endings and beginnings. I walked away without looking back, each step echoing with the sound of truth laid bare. In that dim-lit restaurant, I closed one chapter of my life and began another. The waiter placed a glass of deep crimson before me, its surface reflecting the candlelight like a dark promise. Isla sat frozen across the table, her cheeks flushed, partly from the wine she'd just sipped, partly from the sudden chill that fell between us. Damien leaned forward, eyes darting between us as though seeking permission to speak. But Isla lifted a trembling hand and placed it on the tablecloth, fingers splayed as if she were bracing herself against an unseen tremor. I folded my fingers around the stem of my glass and inhaled the sharp, tannic scent of the red. Notes of blackberry, cedar, a hint of smoke. Wine, I realized, could taste like betrayal if you swallowed it the wrong way. She cleared her throat. Grant, please. Her voice wavered, the single word carrying 1,000 apologies I wasn't yet ready to hear. I raised my glass and took a deliberate sip, letting the wine coat my tongue and burn down my throat. It felt like swallowing fire and ice at once, burning away the disbelief, then icing over my heart to numb the shock. I set the glass down with a soft click that resonated louder than any shout. Dry, just like I said. I murmured to the empty chair beside her, as if explaining my order to an audience of one. Isla swallowed. Her lips quivered, and I watched her inhale, the movement reminding me of the first time she kissed me, a breath held in soft anticipation, a tiny tremor of nerves. That memory pierced me. Grant, she began again, this time softer, more urgent. This isn't what it looks like. I let out a slow exhale, the air trembling in my chest. Isla, I said quietly, leaning forward so my voice would reach only her. I'm looking at what it looks like. I held her gaze, searching for any flicker of the woman I believed in, the partner I thought would never lie to me. Damien's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his own glass. He glanced at Isla, as though asking silently for guidance on whether to speak. She met his gaze and shook her head barely perceptibly. No words. He nodded, withdrawing his hand and retreating into silence. I turned back to Isla. The amber glow of the candle caught the tears pooling at the corners of her eyes, making them shimmer like fractured glass. She dabbed her finger at one tear that escaped and fell against her collarbone. I watched it slide down the curve of her neck, as though gravity itself were urging her to confess. I leaned even closer, placing both forearms on the table. I trusted you, I said, voice low but steady. I believed every word you ever spoke to me. We built this life on honesty. You promised me nothing but honesty. My words landed heavily, as though each one was a hammer striking the foundation of us. She opened her mouth to respond, her lips quivering, but no words came. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the tablecloth, tracing a pattern in the weave with her fingertip. The silence stretched, a taut rope between us. I breathed in the scent of garlic and basil from the plates of neighboring diners, the distant clatter of a dropped fork, the soft murmur of other lives continuing beyond our private collapse. And then Isla exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that sounded like surrender. Grant, she whispered, voice cracking. I never meant for you to find out like this. I nodded slowly, as though acknowledging the truth of her words without condoning the method. Explain, I said gently. I'm listening. Tears slipped down her cheeks now, glinting in the candlelight. She swallowed hard and looked up, meeting my eyes with raw vulnerability. His name is Damien, she began, voice trembling. We met a few months ago at a work event. He's in tech, and I was there for a charity gala. We talked about your work. He's mentioned how much he admires you, and there was an instant connection. She paused, as though afraid her next words would break the fragile thread holding her courage together. It started innocently. Coffee after work. Lunch meetings. He was engaging, attentive, supportive in a way I felt I needed. Her shoulders trembled, and she pressed a palm to her chest. I know how that sounds, but I felt something missing between us. My stomach twisted into a knot. Every word sounded like a confession of betrayal, a litany of excuses thinly veiled as context. I opened my mouth to ask when innocent stopped being innocent, but a lump formed in my throat, and I cleared it instead. Isla's confession continued in ripples of halting sentences, her voice breaking as she described stolen afternoons and whispered phone calls. I watched her, my heart splintering as the details unfolded. Dinners paid for by my credit card, weekends away charged to secret hotel bookings, late-night Uber rides that led her away from home with an ease I had once admired. Time dilated until each confession felt infinitely long. The restaurant lights dimmed in and out, and the low hum of conversation faded around us, isolating our table in a pool of golden light. She stared at me with tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped together atop the table. I'm sorry, she ended, voice nearly strangled. I never wanted to hurt you. I swallowed. The wine glass trembled in my hand, condensation beating beneath my fingers. I set it down without a word. My mind raced through every nuance of our life together, every shared laugh, every whispered promise, every dream. And yet, here it was, a life redefined by this single, seismic moment. I realized I wasn't angry. I was grieving. Grieving the loss of a future I'd never have now, grieving the truth that had been hidden behind her smile. Finally, I spoke, voice soft but resolute. I'm not mad at him, I said, glancing at Damien, whose face had gone pale. I'm not mad at you, either. My words felt strange, unfamiliar, as though born from a stranger's mouth. I'm disappointed, I continued. I'm disappointed that the person I trusted most decided to build a secret life rather than share her doubts with me. I stood then, placing both hands flat on the table, fingertips brushing the edge of her ring. But I gave you my trust. I gave you my love. And you broke them both. Isla opened her mouth, but I shook my head gently. Save it, I told her. I know how it ends. I picked up my glass, raised it one last time, this time to nothing, and walked away before anyone could stop me. Outside, the night air tasted like rain and renewal. My steps echoed down the sidewalk, carrying me away from the table where truth tasted like wine and leaving behind the woman I once called my future. I didn't storm out in a blaze of fury. I didn't hurl accusations or slam dishes across the table. Instead, I sat back for a moment after Isla's final apology, the tremor in my chest slowing to a dull ache. The candle's flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the white linen, and I noticed every detail. The concentric rings of sauce on our plates, the curve of the wine glass's rim, the way Damien's shoulders sagged in silent resignation. Everything felt small and fragile under the weight of what had just been revealed. I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter aftermath of her confession, and slowly reached for my left hand. My fingers found the smooth circle of metal that had symbolized our union, our vows, the promises we exchanged in front of family and friends. It was cold against my skin, an object so familiar that it once felt like an extension of myself. Tonight, though, it felt foreign, like the ring of a stranger clasped around my finger. As I slid it free, I felt years of memories, laughter, and morning coffee slip away with it. The sensation was sharp, like ripping a page from a story halfway through the final chapter. I held the ring in my palm for a long heartbeat, feeling its weight, a single piece of metal that represented everything we'd built, now rendered meaningless. I placed it gently on the table between us, letting it rest on the linen as though offering it back to her. The ring caught the candlelight and glinted brightly, mocking in its brilliance. It was the culmination of our years together, yet here it lay broken by deceit. My hands trembled slightly as I stood, smoothing my jacket over my shoulders. I looked down at Isla's face, at the tears still clinging to her lashes, at the way her eyes pleaded for understanding. But I realized I didn't owe her understanding anymore. I had owed her trust, which she had shattered. I owed myself a chance to heal, and that began with recognizing that I no longer belonged at this table. Enjoy your date, I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. I watched as the words hit her like stones sinking in water, watched her shoulders visibly slump. Damien looked up, confusion and remorse warring on his face. He reached out as if to touch my arm, to apologize or explain, but Damien's apology would never be enough. I stepped around the table, feeling the curious stares of other diners brush across my back, and moved toward the exit with deliberate calm. Each step echoed in my mind, a metronome marking the end of our story. Outside, the night air hit me like a tidal wave, crisp and liberating. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the scent of rain-damp pavement and distant city lights. I didn't look back. I didn't want to imprint her image in my mind any longer than I already had. The ring in my pocket felt heavy. I considered tossing it on the sidewalk like trash, but that would have felt too flippant, too dismissive of the years we'd shared. Instead, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and held it there, a reminder of the strength I needed to reclaim. I walked down the street alone, shoulders straight, heels clicking in the night. Every step took me further from the lie I'd just severed. My mind raced through the immediacy of what came next. The phone call to Tariq, the drive to the lawyer's office, the confrontation with our joint accounts. But for now, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the sting of loss without burying it under action. The city lights danced on slick asphalt, and I realized how long it had been since I'd seen the world so clearly, unfiltered by love's haze. I found myself outside the bar where our friends gathered, a familiar haunt, now hollow in my mind. I paused at the door, listening to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses inside. For a second, I considered slipping in, drowning my pain in the comfort of old camaraderie. But I shook my head. I wasn't that man anymore. The man who needed distraction, who ran from pain, was gone. I was someone new, a man who faced truth head-on, who refused to hide behind false smiles or polite conversation. I turned away and hailed a cab, giving the driver the address of my lawyer's office without preamble. The city slid past in blurred lights as I sank into the seat, the ring pressing coldly into my palm. I thought of Isla's face, haunted, regretful, lost, and felt a fierce ache for the woman I once knew. But I also felt a quiet relief, a spark of possibility that came from shedding a life that no longer fit. I was entering uncharted territory, and although the road ahead promised challenges, it was mine to travel. At the lawyer's office, I pored over our financial records by harsh fluorescent light. I uncovered hidden accounts, unexplained withdrawals, hotel charges tucked into the middle of the night. Each receipt was a testament to her duplicity, and each number fueled my resolve to protect what remained of my life. The revulsion I felt at each discovery was tempered by gratitude. For clarity, for opportunity, for the knowledge that I could rebuild on solid ground rather than continue dancing on the edge of an illusion. When I left the office in the early hours, the sky was paling with the first hints of dawn. I walked to a bench overlooking the lake, rain droplets still glittering on the wooden slats. I sat there until the sun crested the horizon, painting the water gold. I held the ring in my palm and watched as the light caught its edges. Finally, I stood, slipped it back into my pocket, and whispered, "Thank you for showing me the truth." Then I walked away, leaving behind the ring, leaving behind the lie, stepping toward a life defined not by what I had lost, but by what I still had, my integrity, my self-respect, and the unshakable knowledge that I had the power to choose my own path. That night, sleep eluded me. My apartment felt unbearably quiet, the hum of the refrigerator a cruel lullaby against the storm raging in my mind. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. Isla's easy laughter, the warmth of Damien's hand on hers, the cold clink of my ring as it slid from my finger. My heart hammered against my ribs with each flash of memory, and I knew that nothing could restore the innocence of our marriage. So I rose with the moon still high in the sky, steeling myself for departure. I moved through our shared home like a ghost retracing familiar patterns. I gathered clothes, but I also gathered truths, old photographs, letters from her family, mementos of happier days. I placed them in a suitcase with deliberate care. Each item felt charged with betrayal, her lipstick smudge on the collar of my favorite shirt, a ticket stub from a concert I never attended. The paintbrush we once used to repaint our kitchen together. Even our wedding invitation sat between socks and underwear, a pamphlet of promises turned hollow. I paused over it, my fingers tracing the embossed silver lettering. The word forever stared back at me, a mocking echo of what she had said we would be. I made no note. I didn't call her. I didn't owe her any final mercy. Instead, I left her the empty apartment to wake into her own guilt. I turned off the lights, slipped out the front door, and let the cool night air slash across my face. I locked the door behind me and dropped the key in the mailbox. The click of metal against metal sounded like closure. I walked to my car, suitcase in tow, and drove away without glancing in the rearview mirror. Dawn arrived as a pale promise, and I felt its weight pressing on my shoulders as I stepped into the lawyer's office. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh clarity. I sat opposite a woman in tailored gray, her pen poised above a legal pad. I told her my name, then my purpose, to untangle the finances of a marriage that had dissolved before sunrise. I handed over my ID and our joint account statements. The air tasted of fresh coffee and impending reckoning. What unfolded next was like reading the secret diary of someone else's life. Line after line, I uncovered charges I'd never questioned, late-night hotel bookings in cities I'd never visited, hidden credit card accounts with balances that dwarfed my own, Michelin-starred dinners billed to dinner with a friend. Each receipt arrived with a pang of recognition, my card's last 4 digits staring up at me like confessions. I flipped through pages of digital statements, my spine growing rigid with each discovery. There was a weekend in New Orleans, 2 nights at the Ritz, cocktails and oysters that cost a small fortune. There were spa packages billed under Isla's maiden name, as though she sought healing without my knowledge. As the lawyer summarized the evidence, I felt a fierce clarity settle over me. She didn't simply betray my heart. She siphoned our money, our time, our shared future, and used it to seed a life that excluded me. I asked about our home equity line, our investments, our savings. She marked each line with a red pen, highlighting transactions that suggested an entire parallel life. Flights to meet Damien, extravagant bouquets delivered at odd hours, cab rides from restaurants that ignored our wedding anniversary. Each entry was proof that my trust had been her slush fund. I sat back and let it sink in. I wasn't angry. Anger would have felt too raw, too human. Instead, I felt resolved. I instructed the lawyer to freeze our joint accounts, to set in motion the dissolution of our marriage, and to recover what was rightfully mine. I signed documents that felt like blueprints for a new life. The woman in gray watched me with professional detachment, but I sensed the weight of her respect when she called me Mr. Ellison as I left. Stepping back into the morning light, I inhaled deeply, the air enlivened by the scent of rain-damp pavement and freshly brewed coffee from the cafe across the street. I clutched the legal folder, our finances laid bare, as though it were a map leading me away from betrayal. I drove toward an uncertain future with a heart tempered by truth. Each mile took me further from the life I had lost and closer to the man I was rediscovering. Someone who refused to be defined by deceit. Someone who knew that freedom often begins with the courage to confront the darkest corners of your own story. The day dawned gray and listless, a reflection of the heaviness lodged in my chest. I sat in my new flat's empty living room, sunlight creeping through the blinds and casting stripes across the bare floor. The walls were unadorned, the furniture sparse. A single couch, a coffee table, and a small bookshelf already half filled with novels I'd long intended to read. It wasn't home yet, but it was mine. I ran my hand along the edge of the couch cushion, feeling its firm promise of comfort without pretense. My phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced at the screen. Micah, Islah's brother. He'd always looked at me like family, trusted me to look after his sister when I arranged surprise birthday dinners or family weekends. I tapped his name. Grant, I saw. I'm so sorry. Call me. I stared at the text, thumb hovering over the reply button. The instinct to answer him, share some of the burden, trust someone with my raw hurt, wrestled with the need to stay detached. I left the message unread and turned instead to the envelope waiting on the table, bank statements I'd printed at the lawyer's office. A faint smile crossed my lips at the irony of watching betrayal unfold in neat columns of numbers. I spent the morning combing through every invoice and transaction, highlighting charges to hotels I'd never known, flights I'd never taken, and extravagant dinners she'd insisted were for networking or self-care. Each credit card slip was a confession, each line item a piece of the puzzle she'd constructed beyond my sight. By the time noon rolled around, my heart felt lighter. Each revelation was a severed chain, freeing me from the weight of her duplicity. Still, I craved proof beyond the cold comfort of my own findings. I drafted an email to Islah's employer, an upscale wellness brand with an unwavering ethics policy. I summarized the evidence: the misuse of corporate hospitality benefits, the false expense reports, the conflict of interest with her secret dinners under my credit card. I attached scanned copies of the most damning receipts. Spa packages billed on my debit card, dinner reservations made in her maiden name, a list of transactions describing nights with a close friend. My fingers hovered over the send button. Doubt flickered. Was I stooping to vengeance? Would this destroy her career beyond repair? Then I thought of my 6 years of faith in her, the countless ways she'd taken our shared life for granted. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up worrying about her late calls, the mornings I'd brewed coffee and left it on the nightstand, the kindnesses I'd extended without complaint. Enough kindness had been wasted on deception. I clicked send, feeling the old rush of certainty that comes from acting on principle rather than emotion. Next, I turned to mutual friends, trusted people who believed in us. I drafted a group message with a few key recipients. If anyone needs to know, here's the truth. I summarized the highlights, carefully avoiding venom and personal attacks, sticking to facts. Attachment: detailed account of hotel stays, receipts from restaurants, and notes on hidden credit lines. I hit send on that too. The silence that followed was immediate, heavy in my chest. Within minutes, my phone beeped with acknowledgments, expressions of shock, regret, solidarity. A small comfort, but welcome. Before the day ended, I drove to my parents' house on the outskirts of town. The familiar gravel driveway, the scent of pine trees, the low hum of cicadas drifting through open windows, it all felt like refuge. Inside, Mom greeted me with a half-hug and a sympathetic glance, ushering me to the couch with a warm cup of tea. Dad appeared from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, and offered his silent presence. I poured out the story, the restaurant, the ring, the receipts, the emails. They listened without interruption, sharing my anger without judgment. That evening, I sat on the porch swing with Tarek, his sister Leia beside him. They'd come over with takeout from my favorite barbecue joint, filling the wooden table with ribs, cornbread, baked beans. Laughter slowly returned as we reminisced about college pranks, family vacations, childhood recollections. Leia teased me about how I used to obsessively alphabetize my comic books, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked on cornbread. For the first time in weeks, joy felt possible again. After dinner, Leia handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a key. "To your new place," she said, her dark eyes bright with encouragement. "For a fresh start." Beneath it lay a simple sprout-shaped plant in a rustic terracotta pot. "Something to grow with you." I felt my throat tighten as I accepted the gift. It was a small gesture, easily overlooked, but it meant everything. That night, I returned to my flat and placed the plant on the windowsill. I watched as its tender green leaves caught the last rays of sun, reaching toward the sky. I removed Isla's name from my contacts. I deleted her messages without hesitation. My phone felt lighter, too, freed from the clutter of lies. Later, I sat at my small kitchen table, coffee steaming before me, and opened the laptop. I started drafting a blog post, not about betrayal or revenge, but about trust, resilience, and reclaiming your life when everything you thought you knew falls apart. Words flowed easily, shaped by the clarity I'd won through confrontation, honesty, and unwavering resolve. As I typed the final lines, I didn't lose her. I let her go. And in that release, I found freedom. I realized the mask of our marriage had fallen away, revealing a truth I could finally live with. The man staring back at me in the screen's reflection was calm, stronger for having faced the darkness. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the gentle hum of the city at night soothe me. The journey ahead would have its challenges, but I'd already crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back, only the path forward, one I would walk with honesty at my side and the unwavering knowledge that my peace was mine to claim. I moved into a small flat overlooking the lake, its windows framing the pale blue water like a promise of fresh beginnings. The place wasn't fancy, just a modest living area with a kitchenette, a bedroom barely large enough for my mattress, and a narrow balcony where I could stand and watch swans glide by at dawn. But it was mine, carved out of the wreckage of my old life, and that alone made it feel sacred. The walls were bare when I arrived, so I lined them with photographs of simpler times, childhood vacations with my family, snapshots of card nights with the guys, and candid shots of Isla and me laughing on our first date. I left those there for a moment, like an offering to the past, before moving them aside to make room for new memories. I filled the flat with new things, furniture I picked out myself, free from the weight of shared compromise. A sleek bookshelf for the novels I'd long neglected, its dark wood contrasting against the soft cream walls. A plush armchair by the window, perfect for reading or simply staring at the rippling lake. On the coffee table, I placed a single photograph of my nephews making faces at the camera, their wide grins a reminder that family could be a source of joy rather than pain. I plugged in a record player and set down a stack of vinyl records. Miles Davis, Fleetwood Mac, some Bob Dylan. Music breathed life into the space, filling corners that had felt too quiet. That evening, I unpacked the box containing Isla's things. Her favorite mug, the bathroom scale she'd used obsessively, a stack of magazines I'd never read. I paused over each item, feeling a pang of old affection, then placed them in a bag to return or donate. This act of clearing her traces was unexpectedly cathartic. With each piece I removed, I reclaimed a bit more of myself. The last thing I packed away was the set of matching towels we'd once chosen together. I paused, ran a fingertip over the plush fabric, then folded them and set them aside for charity. It felt right. The next morning I woke early, drawn by the soft pink light of sunrise spilling across the lake. Slipping on a light jacket, I stepped onto the balcony with a mug of coffee steaming in my hands. The world was still settling into day, few joggers on the path below, a lone fisherman casting a line into the glassy surface, seagulls wheeling overhead. I inhaled deeply, tasting the cool air, and for the first time in weeks, felt a quiet contentment settle over me. I didn't miss the hollow echo of the bigger apartment. Here, every sound felt intentional, every moment unfiltered by someone else's presence. Later, Tarek's sister Leia stopped by to check in. She carried her trademark bright smile and a container of homemade stew, heavy with potatoes and thyme. We ate at the small kitchen table, laughter weaving through our conversation as easily as the steam rising from our bowls. She told me about her work at the community kitchen, and I found myself volunteering on the spot, an opportunity to connect, to give back, to root myself in something larger than my own recovery. That night, I invited a few friends over for a casual dinner, just grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a simple salad. They arrived with bottles of wine and stories from their lives, filling the flat with warmth and animated chatter. As I served food, I realized how much I'd needed this, the comfort of friends who saw me not as a betrayed husband but as Grant, the man who could still laugh and care and create new joys. In the quiet that followed, I sat alone on the couch, nursing the last sip of my glass of red. I looked around at the small flat I'd built for myself and felt a surge of pride. This room, this life, didn't need her validation to exist. It was a space defined not by loss but by possibility. I picked up my phone and snapped a photo of the moonlight dancing on the lake, then replied to Leia's text. "Thank you for everything. This place already feels like home." As I closed my eyes that night, I understood that a room without her was not an emptiness to be feared but a canvas awaiting the strokes of my own choosing. And with that thought, sleep finally came, gentle and deep, guided by the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Weeks had passed since I first walked away, and each sunrise felt more like a gift than a reminder of what I'd lost. That evening, I found myself gathered around a large oak table in Leia's apartment, surrounded by laughter that felt unforced and warm. Plates of pasta and crusty bread were passed around, glasses clinked, and stories tumbled out. Ridiculous office mishaps, childhood pranks, and the kind of comfortable banter that cemented friendships. I sat back in my chair, the candlelight flickering across everyone's faces, and realized how strangely peaceful I felt. Peaceful enough to reflect, to laugh, and to share my own story without the sting it once carried. Leia slid a bowl of steaming rigatoni my way. "You look different," she said with a teasing grin. "Better, even." I smiled, twirling noodles on my fork before taking a bite. The rich tomato sauce tasted like home and possibility all at once. "I feel different," I admitted. "I'm finally sitting at a table I chose for myself." Around me, nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Micah raised his glass and said, "To new beginnings," a sentiment I echoed as I lifted my own. Later, someone asked how I'd managed to stay so composed the night I confronted Isla. I set my glass down gently and leaned back, remembering every detail of that dim-lit restaurant. "Because I wasn't just interrupting their date," I said quietly. "I was setting a place for my own peace." The table fell silent for a moment as my words sank in. Then someone shouted for another round of drinks, and the room buzzed back to life. When the dishes were cleared, Leia suggested we head to the balcony for fresh air. I stepped outside onto the cool night, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Leia joined me, handing me a glass of wine. "You've come a long way," she said softly, her dark eyes reflecting street lamps in the distance. I nodded, staring out at the skyline. "I've learned that endings aren't always bad," I replied. "Sometimes they're necessary chapters for new stories." She smiled and rested a hand on my shoulder. "You deserve happiness," she whispered. That simple truth felt profound, wrapping around me like a warm blanket on a chilly night. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and let myself believe it. That night, I returned to my Lakeview flat and stood on the balcony, the silver moonlight dancing on the water's surface. I held the small plant Leia had given me, its leaves now full and vibrant, and felt the weight of transformation in its growth. I realized that, unlike betrayal, growth couldn't be manufactured. It happened in its own time, nourished by light and patience. I set the plant on the railing, then turned and walked inside. I slipped off my jacket, placed it on the back of a chair, and sat at my desk, where my laptop awaited. I opened the document I'd started weeks ago and began typing. Tonight, I set a table not defined by others' choices, but by my own. I choose laughter, friendship, and the quiet certainty that I am whole. Each word flowed easily, unburdened by past pain. When I finally closed the laptop, fatigue tugged at my eyelids. I climbed into bed, the linens cool and inviting. As I lay there, I thought about how far I'd come, from disbelief to confrontation, from hollow apartments to rooms filled with genuine connection, and from the ache of betrayal to the warmth of self-discovery. I drifted towards sleep with a smile on my face, knowing that the table I'd set for myself would always have a place for hope, resilience, and the promise of tomorrow.